Hello, my name is Dr. Aditi and today we're talking about nervous tissue. So today we're going to be talking about the basic structure of a neuron, the different types of neurons, the list of glial cells that are found in the central nervous system and also in the peripheral nervous system. And we're going to talk about their function and a little bit about their structure. Now this is a very general overview. There's a lot more, as you can imagine, in each of those categories that I will cover in more extensive videos on that specific topic. So let's get cracking. All right, nervous tissue is basically the body's communication network, right? It's akin to the high-speed internet system we've all gotten used to and rely on. Like how frustrating it is when you don't have a Wi-Fi or high-speed internet, right? We just can't function without it. Same thing, our body does not function well when our nervous system is not working well. And that's actually the whole realm of rehabilitation, right? But neurons are the primary cells of the nervous tissue and they act like the computers in a network. What they do is they process and transmit information. So let me show you the distinction here. We've got neurons that look and act like the main part of computation and communication, and then we've got glial cells, which are known to play more of a supporting role of nervous tissue. And basically there's a lot of research going on that says glial cells are not just for support, but they actually may play a huge role in signaling. However, there's more extensive research that needs to be done on that. However, what we do know that neurons are the core, the key players here. But without glial support, they would not be able to function. And I mean, think about that in your everyday life, right? All of us use a computer, and how many times have you had to call IT support begrudgingly, but you've had to, right? Because without that IT support, you probably couldn't function. Most of us probably, just try to power things off and on and think that's going to work. And sometimes it does, but a lot of the times it doesn't. And that's why you need IT support. So a neuron cannot function without glial cells, and because they play a huge role in maintaining the health of the neurons. All right, so before we get started on other aspects, I wanted to sort of go over what a neuron looks like. So here we have a visual of that, and let's take a peek. So the main part of the neuron is the cell body, which is also known as the soma, and it has these extensions or these sort of cell membranes that are called processes. Now neurons have one and only one axon, typically a fiber that sort of emerges from the cell body and projects into target cells. And it is the axon that propagates the nerve impulse, and it's communicated to one or more cells. And the other processes that you see that are sort of fingering out, those are actually called dendrites, and they receive information from other neurons and specialized areas of contact called synapses. Now, what happens is the information flows through the neuron from these dendrites across the cell body and then goes down to the axon, right? And this is what gives the neuron a polarity, meaning that information only flows in one direction. And that's what happens where the axon emerges from the cell body. That's where the your neural information will flow in that direction, and that actual spot where it becomes the fat part of the cell body becomes this skinnier part of the axon is called the axon hillock. This tapering off the cell body towards the axon fiber is the axon hillock, and there the cytoplasm changes a little bit, the contents change, and there is limited components of it, but basically it's called an axoplasm at that point. Now this axon hillock that sort of narrows and it begins to transition to the beginning of the axon, it's actually called the initial segment there, and that's where action potentials are generated, and it's sort of the trigger zone, I guess, which is a combination of your axon hillock where it tapers down and that initial segment of the axon. Now then what happens, as you can see in this blue part, these axons are wrapped up in insulating substance called myelin, and this myelin has a lot of transmission properties, right? it has insulation and helps those signals move faster. But between the myelin are gaps, and these gaps are going to be called the nodes of Ranvier. And it's important because they play a role actually in how the electric signals pass down. So the length of the axon between each gap, which is wrapped in myelin, is actually referred to an axon segment. So each one of those blue things is actually a segment. And at the end of each axon is an axon terminal. And this is where usually there's several branches of extending fibers that you see, and that will be towards the target cell. And this is where the synaptic end of things, where there'll be like a synaptic end bulb, which you can kind of see at the end. It's sort of, gets a bit wider, and that's going to be your synaptic end bulb. So that's just a brief overview of the the neuron. All right, so there are different types of neurons, believe it or not. Unipolar neurons that you see here are going to be the ones that have only one process emerging from the cell. Now, true unipolar cells or neurons are found in invertebrate animals and actually don't have dendrites. That's the true version. In humans, we do have some unipolar cells, but they're actually called pseudo-unipolar cells. And they have an axon that emerges from the cell body, and it sort of splits so that the axon can extend along very long distances. And these are exclusively sensory neurons and have two unique characteristics. First of all, their dendrites, those projections, receive sensory information. And secondly, the cell body of unipolar neurons are always going to be found in ganglia. Then we've got bipolar neurons, and this is going to be the cells that have two processes which extend from each end of the cell body and are opposite directions. One is the axon and one is the dendrite. So bipolar cells are going to be found in the body, but they're not very common in humans. There's only two spots, actually, your olfactory epithelium, where the sense of stimuli is sensed, or part of the retina. Then we've got multipolar neurons, and these are not unipolar or bipolar, but these are the ones that are found in abundance in our body and do a lot of the nerve impulses. Okay, and now that we've talked about neurons, let's talk about glial cells. Glia comes from the Greek word that means glue, and research shows that the glial cells actually have a bigger and deeper role that we know of. There's a lot more research going on in that, but generally speaking, they have a very supportive role, right, in nourishing and taking care of the neurons, the key players. So in the central nervous system, there are actually 4 glial cells, and the first one is going to be your astrocyte, oligodendrocyte, microglia, and then ependymal cells. Now that's going to be in your central nervous system, and of course we have the Schwann and satellite cells, which are actually in the peripheral nervous system. So again, central nervous system, astrocyte, oligodendrocyte, microglia, and ependymal cell. Peripheral nervous system, we've got satellite and Schwann cells. But basically the function of glia are highlighted here also, and they are all about providing support as far as astrocyte and satellite cells. That's what they do. Oligodendrocytes offer insulation and myelination, as do Schwann cells. And then microglia serve as the immune system for the central nervous system, and the ependymal cells create cerebrospinal fluid. And we're going to talk about them more at depth as we move forward. All right, let's take a peek at astrocytes, right? Now, astrocytes are found in the CNS, And they're so named because they have this star-shaped property, right? And they have many processes that extend from the main cell body. They're not axons or dendrites like neurons, they're just called extensions, right? And these processes extend to interact with neurons, blood vessels, or connective tissue that covers the CNS, specifically in the pia mater. But some ways in which they support the neuron is they maintain concentration of chemicals in the sort of extracellular space. They remove signaling molecules, and they also react to sort of any tissue damage and assist with repair. And one of the big roles is they contribute to the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier is a very important player here. It's a physiological barrier that keeps many substances that circulate in the rest of the body from getting into the central nervous system, right? Because obviously our central nervous system, our brain, is very, very important to protect. So it restricts what can cross from the blood into the CNS. Nutrient molecules, let's just say, for example, glucose or amino acids, can pass through the blood-brain barrier because we need them, right? But there are other molecules that are just too big or can't. So this can actually pose a problem for things like drugs. So pharmaceutical companies have to get really creative, and they have to know all the properties to figure out how is this going to get across that blood-brain barrier. But astrocytes play a big role in this. Okay, now we're looking at oligodendrocytes, which reminds me of an octopus. I don't know if you equate it to this, but basically if you break down the word oligodendrocyte, it means oligo is few, dendro means branches, and then cyte, as you know, means cells. So oligodendrocytes are actually very prominent in their role because what they do is they have sort of these processes that extend from one cell body, and they reach out and sort of surround an axon and insulate it in myelin. So that's why I think of it like an octopus. I imagine that's what an octopus does, right? It has these long legs or arms that can sort of grab, and that's exactly what an oligodendrocyte does. It grabs the adjacent or surrounding axon and insulates it. And the quality here is that it can do it for more than one oligodendrocyte. It doesn't have to be just one. It can do it for several. So it's quite efficient. And it basically myelinates multiple axon segments, either on the same axon or separate axons. And that's the role it plays. The next one is microglia. Again, this is found in the CNS, and as the name implies, it's smaller than the other sort of glial cells. And again, there's a lot of research going on into these cells. And there is some inference here that they originate as white blood cells called macrophages, and then they become part of the CNS during early development. While their origin is not very conclusively determined, we do know that their function is related to what macrophages do, right, in the rest of the body. So macrophages are designed to engulf and break down damaged or diseased cells in the body and ingest them as necessary. That's what microglia do. So I sort of consider them the resident macrophages in the CNS, essentially. All right, now we've got ependymal cells. Now, these are glial cells that filter the blood to make cerebrospinal fluid that circulates throughout the CNS. Now, I don't know if you remember from other anatomy classes, the choroid plexus. And that is a specialized structure in the ventricles of the brain where ependymal cells come in contact with other blood vessels, and their job is to filter and absorb components of the blood to produce that CSF. And because of this, ependymal cells can be considered part of the blood-brain barrier, or basically where the blood-brain barrier breaks down, right? So these cells are very important, and they're very similar to the epithelial cells in that they have this single layer of cells with very little intercellular space, and it has those tight junctions that we talked about in epithelial tissues between adjacent cells. The other thing they have in common with epithelial cells is they also have cilia, right? Because that's going to be present on their apical surface to move CSF through the ventricular spaces. All right, let's move on to the next category, which is going to be your, gosh, I did a number on this one, the satellite cells, which are the peripheral nervous system. Now, these cells, the satellite cells, are actually found in sensory or autonomic glia, where they surround the cell and they sort of cocoon it to form a protective sheath or neuron. And what they do, a protective sheath around the neuron, let's just say, they control the extracellular environment by regulating things like ion concentration or neurotransmitter levels, and they're very important specifically for nerve regeneration after an injury, for example. So satellite cells are found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, now we've got Schwann cells, which is also found in the peripheral nervous system, and this is going to be your cell that looks or is the counterpart to oligodendrocytes in the CNS. They're a little different, though, than oligodendrocytes in that Schwann cells wrap around a portion of one axon segment and no others, whereas oligodendrocytes have processes, right? They have multiple processes, so they can reach an entire, reach out to multiple axon segments, whereas the Schwann cell surrounds it just around one. So the nucleus and the cytoplasm of Schwann cells tend to be towards the edge of the myelin sheath. So that's another characteristic that you could look out for. Right. Of course, we can't talk about nervous tissue and not talk about myelin, right? Myelin is one of the most important features of nervous tissues. It's sort of like the insulation on electrical wires, which allows signals to travel quickly and efficiently along axons. Without myelin, these signals would be very weak or slow, and much like frayed or uninsulated wire that loses its electrical current. Myelin sheaths are really important to our nervous system and conductivity. And they're actually formed, as you know, by glial cells, Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, and then in the central nervous system, we've got oligodendrocytes that do the same thing. And they both wrap myelin around axons in segments. And they do this to insulate, but they also create these tiny gaps between these segments, right? It's sort of like a Tootsie Roll along the axon, but there are gaps between each Tootsie Roll. And so these nodes are actually what act like relay stations, and they enable the signal to, instead of sort of go linear, allow it to hop or jump from one node to the next. And this is actually called saltatory conduction. And it's basically a hopping mechanism that significantly speeds up the communication, making myelin essential for those quick reflexes and precise coordination. When you have those quick reflexes, that's your myelinization coming into play. So just as high quality wiring is really important for seamless internet connectivity, right? Myelin ensures that our nervous system functions at its peak performance and that signals are transforming at this fast sort of pace. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what myelin does and why it's important. Okay, I always end with a mind map, as you know, because I find it to be the most comprehensive way of putting everything together. And I know you're probably like, gosh, she just bangs on about mind maps, but they are really important for your learning and mastery of information. And not only that, it helps you connect things that you've learned and sort of comprehensively look at the purview of a bigger picture. So I do have a template for each mind map that I show you. It's in an ebook on my website if you're interested. And basically it gives you a shell that you can fill in. So here we have nervous tissue, obviously being the topic, and neuroglia that are present both in our central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And then as you can see, I've added cells. You can draw these cells, which would be even better, or trace them if you can't draw, if you don't feel comfortable drawing. Anyway, ependymal cells are the ones that line the ventricles. They produce CSF. Like, you just need to know the main characteristics here, right? Oligodendrocytes form myelin sheaths for the CNS and increase signal transmission and speed, provide support and stability. Astrocytes, these are going to regulate your blood-brain barrier, maintain homeostasis, and are really going to be important for after injury. Microglia, remember, those are the resident macrophages of the CNS because they play an immunity role. And then if we're looking on the other side, the blue part, which is your peripheral nervous system, you can see that we've got satellite cells and then Schwann cells. And your satellite cells are going to be the ones that are very protective. They sort of have the supportive sort of cocoon aspect. And they do a lot of regulation also in the environment. And then, of course, we've got Schwann cells, which have the myelin sheath, and they actually form the sheath to improve that connectivity, as you remember. So anyway, this is just a purview and overview of what we've talked about today. Now I'm going to leave you with Ollie, who has a riddle for you, and please reach out or comment below if you'd like other topics covered, or if there's anything specific in this video that you liked or didn't like, because that helps me produce better content for you. So until next time, see you then.